Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Lunch and Learn web series. This is the first of 5 such webinars that are going to be taking place throughout November and into December. My name is Shauna Dahl, and I work as the Gulf Islands Forest Project Coordinator for Raincoast Conservation Foundation, and I will be facilitating today's discussion. So these educational sessions have been organized by Raincoast Conservation Foundation to address complex environmental issues being explored by governments at all levels to address the twin biodiversity and climate crises, with a specific focus on coastal Douglas-fir ecosystems characteristic of the Gulf Islands. These discussions feel exceptionally timely right now while the world is in climate talks in Glasgow. The large-scale systemic change is needed to address these more complex global climate issues. I hope that these sessions help to inform and empower attendees to seek better ways of living locally and doing local action. So even folks who are joining from elsewhere outside of the Coastal Douglas-fir zone, I hope that you can take some lessons from these sessions as well. I think it's important to recognize that I'm calling in from the territory of the Algonquin-speaking people, the Songhees and Esquimalt nations, but I would also like to recognize that many of the folks joining us here today are on the traditional territories of very diverse Coast Salish nations across the region, and I just want to recognize that before we get started. And just a few housekeeping things as we move into the speaking portion of our webinar. Today's topic is freshwater availability, options for maintaining a healthy water supply into the future. I'm joined today by 3 experts who will be speaking to this issue. But before I introduce them, there are a few things that you need to know. Basically, audience members aren't able to actually speak throughout the session, but they are welcome to share questions and comments in the chat box that you see on the side of your screen on YouTube or on Facebook. I will see them, and I will be taking stock of all of those questions and recording them so that we can ask our speakers. After each speaker presents, there'll be a chance to ask maybe 1, maybe 2 questions, depending on the time, so we can get people involved throughout the conversation. And then at the end, we'll address more questions and have more of a panel discussion. So if your question doesn't get addressed right away, no worries. We will get to it at the end. So I know that there's still some folks that might be joining. So before I introduce our first speaker, I'm just going to give a few more minutes to make sure that folks are able to hop on. I know people are joining us on their lunch breaks, so I want to give some ample time so that people can land here. I'm not seeing any comments come in, but as people enter, maybe they can let us know where they're calling in from. Maybe the traditional territory that you find yourself on. It looks like we've got 39 people tuned in so far. We've got Darren from Hornby Island, Comox territory. 2 people from Hornby, someone from Galliano. Awesome, thanks for sharing, folks. Just give it another few seconds, give a little bit more time. All right. By my clock, we're hitting, Tahoe Vista. Nice. So by my clock, we're hitting 12:05, so we'll get started now with our first speaker. So we've got Dr. Diana Allen joining us first. Diana is a professor of hydrology in the Department of Earth Sciences at Simon Fraser University. Her research focuses on studying the processes that take place as natural groundwater systems respond to stressors like climate change, developing strategies to assess risks to water security, and ultimately informing decision makers and policies. So without further ado, I'm going to give Diana the full screen.
All right, can you see my screen? Can you see it?
Yeah, we can see it. Thank you.
Okay, great. Okay, so today I'll talk very briefly about climate change influences on groundwater availability in coastal BC. And I'm going to start off with answering the question, first of all, what is groundwater recharge? Because there's been a lot of interest in groundwater recharge from a water budget perspective. So groundwater recharge is the addition of water to the water table, and we measure that in millimeters per year. So there's two main types of recharge. One of them is diffuse recharge from precipitation, and that's what I'm going to focus on today. But there's also focused recharge that we can get from surface water bodies. So for example, streams or lakes that lose water to the groundwater system. So just in terms of the process, we have above the water table, so I'm showing the water table at the bottom of this column here, there's a soil zone sitting at the top that on the Gulf Islands is roughly a meter or so thick. And then underlying that, there would be sediment, or in the case of the Gulf Islands, Sunshine Coast bedrock. And all of this zone is unsaturated, meaning that the water is not fully filling the pores of the soil and the sediment. So when it rains, we end up with some of that water adding moisture to the soil zone. And there's also trees that might be taking up some of that water from the soil zone, and that water gets lost to evapotranspiration. Of the amount of water that does not get lost to evapotranspiration, it will percolate down and add recharge to the groundwater system. So it sounds like a very simple mechanism here, but it turns out that it's very difficult to estimate recharge because there are so many different factors that influence how much recharge occurs, when it occurs, and where it occurs. Some of these factors include climate, topography, vegetation, soil type, and geology. So just as a very simple illustration on the right, when precipitation lands on the ground surface, it partitions. So some of the water will go as overland flow or runoff. Some of the water, as I showed on that last slide, will be lost to evapotranspiration, either directly from the soil zone or from the trees and plants that are on the land surface. And whatever the balance is will infiltrate down and become part of that groundwater recharge. To the right here are two different kind of extreme scenarios for recharge and how much ultimately would get down into that groundwater system. And in the top example, we have a very steep slope. We have few trees on the ground surface, and we have fractured rock. So this would be quite similar to the type of terrain and geology that we have on the Gulf Islands. In that sort of situation, a lot of the water is actually lost to runoff. So that's shown by this very large arrow here. If you have, in contrast, sediments that are very highly permeable, topography is really flat, then very little runoff takes place and a much greater proportion goes down to contribute to recharge to the groundwater system. So these are just two very simple end members of recharge. When we look at recharge, we use provincial observation wells to get an idea of how the water table varies over time. And here's a graph that shows precipitation as these bars on the bottom for different months of the year from 2013 to 2014, and the records for 3 observation wells on the Gulf Islands. So there's three things of interest here. One is that our rainy season tends to be in the fall and early winter, and we notice that the groundwater levels rise up quite rapidly and they stabilize. They reach kind of a maximum level, and then once the rainy season ends, the groundwater levels start to drop off because there isn't any additional or any major precipitation happening during the late spring through the summer and into the fall. So this is pattern that we see in groundwater levels across the region. And occasionally we'll see, if you had a very big rain event, we might see some spikes in that groundwater level. So the water gets into the system, but then the water also has to come out again. So there's three ways that water can come out of the groundwater system. So here's the first example where we have our infiltration going down into the bedrock. And as that water is added to the subsurface, the water table will rise up and groundwater will flow. Always flows from high elevation to low elevation areas. But in this situation, we're on a hill slope, and the water table during the time of the year where there's not a lot of precipitation ends up being intersecting the land surface down here. But during the rainy season, the water table intersects the land surface up here, and so we end up seeing seepage. And so groundwater is discharging along this slope. We also, in a coastal environment, so here's an example of an island, we have infiltration to the rocks, and groundwater flow will be discharging at an island scale out towards the coast. What's important about this situation is that this is seawater out here, this ocean water, and so underneath the island, or even a coastal aquifer, we have a freshwater lens. And this is the only available fresh water that we have on these islands. And um, there's a zone between the fresh water and the salt water that lies at depth underneath the island. So on an island, a good proportion of the water, groundwater that's discharging ends up out in the ocean. And this fresh water supports the marine ecosystems and maintains this freshwater lens under the island. And so if our recharge is decreasing and we reduce the amount of fresh water coming in, we will ultimately see this freshwater lens shrinking in size, and this interface between the freshwater and the saltwater moving inland. Finally, we have discharge to streams. So groundwater, if there are streams on an island, then you'll have some of the groundwater discharging into them. And this groundwater discharge provides the base flow to a stream. And often during the summertime, the base flow is the only flow that is occurring in that stream channel. In addition to that, groundwater is generally quite cool compared to surface waters during the summertime. So that cool groundwater discharging into the stream maintains or moderates the high temperature fluctuations that we see in stream conditions. Ultimately, any groundwater that we use, so by consuming it, consumption, will reduce the amount of discharge either to the ocean or to these streams. So how do we estimate recharge? Well, there have been a number of approaches taken for estimating recharge in the Gulf Islands. A lot of this work was done by my group, but we've tried so many different methods. And what I'm going to share with you today is the results from Gabriola Island, where we used a software package called Mike Shee to estimate the recharge. And it turned out it was roughly 20% of precipitation. The problem is that when we try to model or estimate recharge, we're usually using a very simple conceptualization of the subsurface. So our conceptual model kind of looks like this, with a bunch of grains and pore space in between, and that's the way the models are estimating recharge. But in reality, we've got fractured rock and we have water that's trying to get into individual fractures. So you might say, well, why use this simple conceptual idea rather than what the real situation would be like? And the problem is that the groundwater on the Gulf Islands is very complicated. We have different rock units in the subsurface. Those rock units have fractures and the water's flowing through the fractures. We have fracture zones where groundwater recharge might be concentrated and coming in. So it's a very difficult system to try and model, even conceptually. We use this software called Mike Shee to do this. And I know it's a weird name, but anyway, this model does the entire watershed. So it looks at what is the climate going onto the land surface, what is running off, what is accumulating in lakes, what is getting in and infiltrating into the subsurface. So it's a fully integrated watershed model that we use to estimate recharge. And here are the results for Gabriola Island. So I'm showing mean annual. So over a period of, say, 10 years, what is the average annual recharge that occurs to Gabriola Island? Any of the red little pixels here are red and orange are showing seepage areas. So those hill slopes that I was talking about. And anything in the blue and green, those are the recharge areas. So on an average annual basis, there is a lot of recharge in this green that happens over the top of Gabriola Island, but there's also a lot of seepage areas along the sides. And then there's discharge to the ocean as well. Well, if we compare from year to year, which areas are always recharge areas and which areas are always seepage areas and which ones change between being seepage and recharge, we get this sort of a map here. And it's only these little purple areas that are functioning as recharge areas on Gabriola Island. So we end up with recharge not necessarily just being at high elevation where we might think it would be, but we get recharge happening in different areas across the island. And this pattern is not stable through the year. It changes through the year and it changes from year to year. And this is because of this water table rising and falling and where we have recharge and seepage areas. So how might climate change affect recharge? This is the big question. So we use global climate models or general circulation models to give us projections on how the climate might change. So I pulled these two graphs from PCIC, Pacific Climate Impacts Consortium. And this is a graph, so this is for Gabriola Island, and this is showing the change in temperature into the future, so relative to 1981 to 2010, so that being the historical period. And all of these bars here, the orange ones represent the 2020s, which is where we are right now. The green ones represent the 2050s, and the red bars represent the 2080s. So you can see that quite obviously temperature is increasing consistently as we move into the future. Precipitation, though, sends a little bit of a different message. In the winter time, in the sort of January, February, and then November, December, there is an increase in precipitation, but throughout most of the rest of the year, there's a reduction in the amount of precipitation. So even though on average this region is supposed to get wetter, the amount of precipitation falling during the summer months is actually going to be reduced. The most important impact of that is that with the greater precipitation, which is shown in the green line here, so the blue line is for the 2050s and the green is for the 2080s, precipitation in the winter months and fall will increase, and most of that water is going to be lost to runoff, with very little of it contributing to new recharge. So more precipitation does not necessarily translate directly into more recharge. The other interesting question, though, is what if we have more heavy rain events? The heavier the rain event, the more runoff we get. And climate change projections suggest that our rain events are going to become a lot heavier. So we may get even less recharge taking place in the winter months. And likewise, what if we have summer droughts that last longer? Are the groundwater levels going to recover from that after a very long dry period? The last point here is salinization. So salinization of coastal aquifers, because of that ocean water body surrounding that freshwater lens, salinization is a really important process, and we can cause aquifers to become salinized due to groundwater pumping. but also due to overwash events. So if we start getting big storm surges, you can end up with water from the ocean overtopping the land surface, and then that salt water infiltrating down into the aquifers. And at the same time, sea level rise is supposed to happen, and so that will also push that salt water in towards the land surface. So this is Ganges on Salt Spring Island showing areas where there's high hazard in red of salinization of the aquifers. So in summary, we have recharge areas that vary spatially and temporally. We have seepage in low elevation areas and at the base of steep topography. And recharge is roughly estimated at about 20% of precipitation on a long-term average annual basis. Future recharge increases in precipitation will mostly be in the form of increased runoff, and average recharge may increase by 10% over on an annual basis into the future. But you have to remember that the recharge is such a small percent of of how much water goes in anyway, that we might be talking about 20 millimeters a year more recharge, if that. And then finally, saltwater intrusion. These low-lying areas are at risk of storm surge, inundation, and sea level rise, both of which can lead to salinization. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Diana. That was excellent. We had one question come in while you were speaking, so I'll pose that now. This came from John, actually. He asked, does the Mike Shee model honor surface water outflows?
Yeah, the Mike Shee model is a fully integrated land surface subsurface model. So it shows where all that water is coming from and going to.
Awesome. I also got a question about your slides availability. Are your slides available for use elsewhere? Can they be made available to some of the listeners in on this chat?
I'll have to give that some thought because what I usually find is that my slides get misinterpreted because I don't have any notes on them. So I
Absolutely.
usually don't do that.
That's fair. So to the person who asked that question, this presentation will be available on YouTube immediately after this presentation is over. So you'll be able to use them as a reference by looking at the presentation again.
Mm-hmm.
So with that, we will move on to Bridget Gile. Just let me bring her into the stream and take Diana out for a moment. Hello, Bridget. So just by way of introduction, Bridget is a civil and environmental engineering PhD student and Knight Hennessy Scholar at Stanford University. Bridget aspires to create more sustainable and resilient water systems by linking research, policy, and practice through a one water management approach. In her graduate work, she studied the role that alternative water supply strategies, including water reuse, stormwater capture, and desalination, can play in shaping a sustainable, drought-resistant water supply portfolio. So I will let you take it away, Bridget.
Okay, thank you so much, Shauna. Let me get my slides up. Okay, awesome. So like Shauna mentioned, my name is Bridget. I'm an environmental engineering PhD student at Stanford, and I study water supply and decision support space in this area. And so today I'm so excited to be able to share about a case study that I've done on sustainable water supply through an integrated water management approach. And I want to make sure I acknowledge my collaborators, Paul Shudo, Nagina Shori, and Dick Luthi on this work. The goal of our study was to take a look at Monterey County, California, as a case study for communities in California, in the West, in dry environments, and about the challenges and opportunities that they're facing in developing a sustainable water supply portfolio. And we wanted to share knowledge from Monterey's experience, the lessons that they learned from their successes and also their challenges, to identify areas of focus, be they research or policy, that are needed to support water goals in this space. For my presentation today, I'm going to give an overview of the case. I'm going to talk about one of the key challenges this area was facing at the time of my study, and then also start to bridge the conversation towards the Gulf Islands context through some insights from this case study. Monterey County, California is located on the central coast of California, where this red star is. This area is very diverse. It has residential communities, it has agricultural communities. Some of their main industries include the agricultural production and tourism. So both very water-intensive industries that rely on this reliable supply of water for not only people's livelihoods, but also their lifestyles. And so this area is, their water provider is a private company, California American Water, or CalAM. And they're unique because they are not tied into any of the federal or state water projects. And so they don't receive imported water from elsewhere. They have to be entirely self-reliant locally for their water supply. And this area was facing some very real challenges on its conventional water supplies. Its main surface source, the Carmel River, it's actually, the CalAM is under a cease and desist order to stop over extracting from this river. And then the groundwater basins in the area are also suffering from this threat of seawater intrusion, and they're also heavily overdrafted. And so the bottom line is that this community had tapped out its conventional water sources, and they needed to look elsewhere to be able to find a supply that was going to sustain them into the future. And their response actually started back in the 70s with some legislation that was passed increasing standards for wastewater discharge into the environment. And rather than a bunch of different communities all sort of individually retrofitting their plants, they decided to form a regional treatment plant that would meet these standards. And then another important part of the vision was using this pooled source of water to then provide water supply to irrigate crops in the region. And so what was born out of this was the Castroville Seawater Intrusion Project, or CSIP for short. This is a recycled water project that took this municipal wastewater source, treated it kind of past the standard that they would need to just discharge it to the environment, to like a higher standard of tertiary from using an additional filtration step and disinfection, so that this was actually a safe water supply to apply to their edible food crops in the area. And this project came online in 1998. It was a revolutionary project and a great first step towards solving the area's water issues, but it didn't fully address the needs that this area continued to have. And so the next piece of the puzzle was a recycled water project for actual potable drinking water supply. And this was Pure Water Monterey. And the way this looks is actually they take the recycled water and treat it to an advanced standard, and then deliberately recharge it into the groundwater supply. And then about 6 months later, extract that water for drinking water use. And one of the really important parts of how this project came online is it didn't just compete with the agricultural recycled water for this same limited pool of water, but it actually was really novel in introducing this sort of unprecedented suite of recycled water sources to help add volume. And these included food industry processing water, urban runoff from the city of Salinas, and a few different like drainage ditches that were receiving irrigation return flows from the fields. And this was a really important step to both add volume and to demonstrate how to be able to use more of these waste streams of water. And then the final component for how this project looks, how this recycled water network looks today, is this RUAP project, which takes advanced treated water and applies it for landscape irrigation. And so this diagram here kind of shows how these three recycled water projects are like related conceptually. But I also wanted to highlight how this like builds out in space. And so here's the area that's all contributing water to that kind of central wastewater treatment plant. And in purple is the area receiving the agricultural irrigation recycled water. In green is the recycled drinking water. Brown shows those novel source waters that were brought online. And then finally, yellow shows the landscape irrigation customers. And so one of the things that was really important about this case is that just as all of these different communities were contributing flows to the recycled water input, they're all seeing benefits from the projects that they've collaborated to create. So pivoting from kind of the development of the system as it looks today, I wanted to highlight a big challenge that this area was facing at the time I was doing my case study. And that was that even with these 3 recycled projects coming online, the demand in the present time of the area was still just a little bit exceeding what they could legally take from the recycled source, the river source, and the groundwater. And this area had already made a ton of progress in terms of conservation, and they were under some like building restrictions and development restrictions. And so the bottom line was that they really needed an additional supply of water. And to do that, they were looking at 2 different project alternatives. The first was expanding the recycled water project that did the deliberate recharge for potable use. And then the second was constructing a seawater desalination plant. And as I've shown in this table here, these projects differ on a lot of different fronts. First of all, in terms of yield, the desalination plant offered about 3 times the water that a recycled water expansion could offer. But on the other side, it did it at about 3 times the cost and energy demand per unit of water produced. And then on top of that, the intake wells that were proposed for the desalination plant, which I have a schematic of here, there was some environmental justice concern about whether these wells would be sort of illicitly taking water, fresh groundwater from the community that they were located in. And so even just with this like very high level overview of the projects, we already see a lot of layers of uncertainty that are embedded in this decision of which of 2 project alternatives to move forward with. The first main one is in terms of yield. Depending on what the future demand of the area would have been, really controlled whether it made sense to need the additional yield that desalination had to offer compared to a recycled water expansion, which was a much smaller volume. Additionally, the impact of the wells was another point of uncertainty because modeling results, depending on who you asked, showed conflicting outcomes. And then kind of an additional layer on top of everything is that CalAm, as a private company, there was just a little bit of separation in terms of transparency and accountability. And so there wasn't that trust present between the public and their water provider. And so at this point, I want to just take a brief deep dive into desalination, because I know that that is like a topic that has entered into the conversation in the Gulf Islands. And so just as what a typical treatment process would look like is raw water intake from the ocean, pass through a series of filtration steps just to get the water ready for really the star of the treatment process, which is reverse osmosis. And what reverse osmosis does is there's a semi-permeable membrane that allows water to pass through, but not pretty much anything else, and including salt particles, which would be shown here in yellow. And so by applying enough pressure, the plant can actually force the water through the membrane to produce clean water on this side and leave all of the salty water behind. And so one advantage of this desalination as a water supply approach is the reverse osmosis produces really high quality finished water. And then additionally, because the ocean is the water supply source, it's a very drought-proof form of water supply. And then on the other hand, though, some disadvantages is applying that enough pressure to be able to treat the water through the reverse osmosis is very energy intensive. And this energy in combination with the membrane equipment needed can be very expensive. And then finally, when you're left, you produce all this pure water, but you're also left with what's left behind of the super salty rejected water. And that being disposed of into the environment can cause ecological impacts as well. So that's another concern. And this image I have at the bottom of the slide just kind of presents how I like to think of different types of water supply, where you have a finish line, which is safe, potable drinking quality water. And then all of these initial sources of water lie at various distances from this finish line. And so kind of the farther away from the finish line you start, generally the more energy and the more cost it takes to get that water to where it's a potable standard. So bringing this back into the case of Monterey, these 2 bars here illustrate the water supply portfolios that were available. Everything is the same between the 2, except this blue bar here shows the high yield of the desalination plant, and this orange here shows what would be available through expanding the recycled water. And it's clear that desalination offers more water supply total, but really that's important in the context of how much water supply this area is going to need. But unfortunately, this was a point of uncertainty, and these horizontal lines here show where some of the estimates for the long-term demand of the area were coming in. And you can see that, like, depending on which estimate you go with, really changes the decision of whether or not both portfolios would be adequate, or whether you might need the additional yield of desalination. So another way that the area framed this question is like, okay, like, if we can't decide on what the long-term demand of the area is going to be, let's think about how it might grow out from its present status. And so this presents the idea of asking the question of, like, given the current demand, if that's going to grow at a certain rate, how long would it take before the growing demand would outpace what would be available through a recycled water expansion project? And this plot here shows 4 different studies from 4 different authors over a pretty short period of 3 years that answered anything from 5 to 30 years to that question of how long would recycled water see this community through. And so, I don't know, so in some ways adding some insight, in some ways introducing additional complexity. And so one thing that I wanted to highlight about this case is that, you know, there are a lot of different like fronts of uncertainty with what the desalination intake wells would be doing to local groundwater, with what the long-term demand was of the community, with how fast that demand might grow. But I wanted to highlight that the actual debate and discussion around this really largely happened around a single permit, the Coastal Development Permit, that the CalAM's desal project would have needed to move forward. And so this happened at the local level. It got appealed to the state level. There's a lot of public involvement. This image here shows the public comment period at a state hearing on this project. And this is like a jam-packed room, an all-day meeting, literally hours of comments for and against the desal project. And so I thought it was really important. You know, we like to talk about, you know, demand and supplies and hydrology, but for this case, this is really where that decision ended up happening. And so thankfully, for the purpose of today's presentation, I can provide a little bit of conclusion to this chapter that a little over a month ago, CalAM Water Company agreed to the recycled water expansion. And so the door is open in the future if it turns out demand does outpace what the recycled water can provide. The desalination plant is not off the table. But I think what's really important is that the community, you know, took stock of what they knew, where the uncertainty was, and where the preference of their stakeholders were. And so then they decided to make this the next chapter of their story. So tying this together into some insights, one of the things that was really important with how Monterey handled this water supply planning was to involve stakeholders early and often, to prioritize building trust, to recognize uncertainty, and so to build in project designs that were able to adapt to more knowledge gained as the future built out. One thing also, an important way for how you don't often have the public calling for recycled water instead of against. And so I think one thing that was really important was placing this in the context of like concrete local needs, so that it's not just a debate about the abstract, but we can put a place on it. I've listed here just many of the agencies that were involved in these projects becoming a reality. My co-author, Paul, was in the room as these discussions were happening, and he described it as like a house of cards. And so very precarious early on, but able to build something very strong eventually, because these different agencies are contributing a shared vision for where they want their water supply to go, and also able to pool resources, shared infrastructure, and expertise to make it happen. And then one final comment is just the nuts and bolts of actually making alternative water supply happen, is that a recycled water or a desalination or a recharge is going to be more expensive than just pulling water from the ground. But a way to make that, to equitably make that happen, is to think about everyone who's benefiting from those projects and distribute the costs accordingly, so that it's not just a small group that might be shouldering the burden of an entire region's water supply needs. So bringing this all together, just kind of, you know, hitting on prioritizing public outreach and trust, using adaptive planning to navigate uncertainty, and thinking about how these projects are going to be implemented in practice and for equity and for affordability were all just really major components of Monterey being able to move forward with this kind of very innovative water supply solution. So of course, there are many continuing challenges, but I think that with what they've developed in terms of decision-making and procedural equity, I think that that will reflect the ability to be able to handle these continuing challenges. And so I'll leave it at that for today, but I want to thank everyone so much for your attention, and I look forward to continuing our conversation in the Q&A.
Thank you so much. That was super informative. We got a couple of good questions while you were speaking. One that came up is, did the agencies making the decisions have a focus on reducing water demand?
They did. So conservation is really important to this area. Mm-hmm. I think what they saw is that a lot of the conservation had already happened at the time that they, at the most recent time that they were making decisions around, as of the past couple of years where they want to move forward. This area already has some of the lowest per capita water use in the state. And there's a lot of even sort of structural conservation that's in place, such as restrictions on how many appliances hooked into the water you can have for housing, like being able to do new development. And so the conservation continues to be really important, but they certainly found that a lot of the major gains to be had had already been found earlier in the story.
Right. Well, thank you so much. We'll continue with, there's quite a few other questions I have written down here that we will touch on when we get into the discussion portion. But for now, we will hand the floor over to John. So I'll just take you off the screen here, give it over to John. I think that that's your presentation already up and running. So take it away, John. Oh, actually, I need to introduce you, of course. So John has a graduate and postgraduate degree in geoscience. From undergraduate options to world experiences, he has developed a keen awareness of water resources, their management, and associated challenges. He's currently a board member of the Salt Spring Island Water Preservation Society and the project manager for the Water Preservation Society's Salt Spring Island Freshwater Catalog, a project about improving understanding of that island's freshwater. So with that, I will give it over to John.
Great, thank you, Shauna. Yeah, so I think, following these two presentations, I mean, some really good material already there. I think the upfront statement is there are no silver bullets for managing our fresh water, but there are some low-hanging fruits. And and going to the kind of the desalination route is not really something that we need to contemplate right now, but that would be an upfront statement. And I think takeaways from this presentation, it's a short one. It's designed to perhaps trigger some discussion. I don't have all the answers for this island, as I said, no silver bullets. But I think the key message is, if I don't get those words across in other parts of the slides, would be catch it, store it, and use it carefully. And when we talk about store, we go back to Diana's presentation and the whole business of capturing surface water and groundwater in some way, and using both of them carefully. So this is a slide set that looks at options for freshwater supply and local action. The backdrop here also touches a little bit on Diana's presentation about the amount of rainfall that we will get in the winter and the inability to hold it. So this particular backdrop is a rain event from 2019 where we had 6 centimeters of rain overnight, and you can see that this is basically going way out into the bay, a local source from this particular place, but the whole of this estuary was overwhelmed by these massive influxes of sediment from areas of land that perhaps don't have the capacity to store fresh water. Okay. So, and again, going back to Diana's slides, Diana's already very elegantly introduced the whole freshwater lens story, but I think it's worth dwelling on that because it is such an important part of our story for this island. So our island's water is finite. Yeah, it's not conversations continue with individuals around, where does the water come from on this island? I've heard anecdotally and directly actually that the water comes from Mount Baker, the water comes from Cowichan Valley, it comes from somewhere else in the province, but essentially it doesn't, and it's all rainwater. We are completely dependent on that. So however you slice and dice it, it is a finite volume. Whether it's well managed or replenished on an annual basis, it's finite. So I use the words, we have a delicate water balance, and that is today already, and I think in the future with the scenarios that Diana showed for climate change, more rainfall, inability to capture it, longer dry summers, I think the future is going to be a little bit less rosy. So something to keep in mind. The good news is that we can mitigate for it, we can plan around it, and we can help conserve this limited freshwater supply. So the key messages on this slide really are, as Diana showed, rainfall is dominant in the winter. This is a spider plot of precipitation from one of the schools on the island, Phoenix School in Ganges. 5 to 6 months of pretty solid rainfall, and then almost nothing for the rest of the calendar year. So that's it, 100% of our island's fresh water. The storage containers for that fresh water are the surface water bodies. We're fortunate on Salt Spring Island that we have 9 lakes, significant water bodies, and most of those are used in some form. Some significantly, people know about St. Mary's and Maxwell Lakes and Western Creek, Western Lake and Stoll Lake, that all of these water bodies are tapped one way or another. So we have that surface water volume, which is quite significant, and we have groundwater. But if we look at the lens, the groundwater there is an interplay between groundwater and surface water. If we take away the surface water, as Diana said, then the recharge of the groundwater becomes less. So there's the lens. And then the other thing is, of course, if we reduce that freshwater lens, we have the saline intrusions on the coast. So the mixing of saline water with our freshwater systems around the coastline, which is an irreversible process. I lived in the Middle East for quite some time, and I watched as they slowly started to tap into prehistoric waters and limited recharge areas on the coast of the Persian Gulf or the Arabian Gulf, depending on which side of it you look at from, and systematically mine that water and watch the vegetation die back as the saline intrusion came inland. We don't see that on a huge scale here, but there are, as Diana pointed out again, that we do see that in some places on the island. So something to be aware of. Okay, so how do we do that? Mitigate and adaptation story. What can we do? Well, I think the big one, not the silver bullet, but the low-hanging fruit, is rainfall. Today we have very significant rainfall on the island, about 1 meter a year. The climate predictions suggest we'll still get a lot of rainfall. Not necessarily all of it will go into the ground, but I think the key one is to capture some of it, or even more of it if you have systems in place. If those summers are going to be more prolonged, then we need to milk, whatever that word would be. Maybe water and milk don't go together, but we need to exploit the water that lands and capture as much as possible. So where practicable, install more rainwater catchment systems, and I use the words the bigger the better there. There is a footnote there, unfortunately, which is, some of us, myself included, don't have big parcels of land to store tens of thousands of gallons of water, and many people don't have the resources to pay for that installation. So that is an issue, but I think anything that we can do in that space is useful. And then monitor your rainwater systems and adapt your usage. So capture as much as perhaps you can, but look at the way that you're using it and try and minimize that. That's kind of very much the California story. Further down the road, they've got into that conservation world, perhaps, well, actually almost certainly quite a lot more than we have on the island. So conservation measures. So that's the rainwater side of it. The groundwater is the same story. If you've got groundwater, use it carefully. Monitor your well system and again adapt as necessary, and that could be your groundwater well is not capable of supplying sufficiency even in a conservative use world, so consider some surface storage. A lot of people, the province particularly, talk about well sipping And well sipping is best practice. It's about taking any well, but particularly wells that are low delivery, and just taking a little bit of water out of that well constantly through a day, 24 hours, potentially 24 hours a day, and storing that. So that becomes a reserve. It supports the rainwater. You can do it in the summer. You may be depleting the aquifer, but you're doing it very gradually and very gently. So there's no big demand on that difficult and challenged rock that we have surrounding most of our well bores. And with groundwater and surface water to a degree comes the whole chemistry story. Our groundwater on this island is very variable. It's usually very good, but there are areas of the island where groundwater chemistry is not great, and it's worth monitoring, looking for manganese levels, looking for arsenic levels. Just keeping a regular 6 monthly perhaps check on your chemistry of your water is the right thing to do, because over time, with these stresses that we have in place with the climate change and the reduction in recharge water volumes, then it's quite possible that the chemistry that you have 5 years ago will not be the chemistry you see 10 years from now, or even 5 years from now. So, just from a health perspective, it's good practice to check your water chemistry. Okay, so we've got the fresh water, whether it's groundwater or rainfall, they're both in the game. Then I think everyone should think about some sort of irrigation systems. If you have a piece of land, assuming that you have a piece of land where you want to grow things, supplement your local suppliers and actually become your own supplier of produce and things, then look at the irrigation systems, consider irrigation systems, I should say, and review the ones that you have. Bigger is not necessarily better. What do I mean by that? Well, there are these things called soaker hoses that are out there. Soaker hoses are great. They'll give you sufficiency of water over a large area. You can walk away from it and let the watering begin, as it were, and come back and it's all in good shape. But those things can deliver very large volumes of water. So it's good to do some sums. What are those systems delivering? Are there better systems that may deliver in a more efficient manner? So keep that in mind. Don't just assume that every irrigation system is considered equal. And I think we all need to consider what that longer term climate change looks like. None of us know, so it's really a question, as I say there, hedge your bets, or bet on your hedge if it was a gardening analog. What do we need to do? Well, we need to consider climate changing in some way, and it may not be that we see the signs of that in the next 5 to 10 years, but in one of these similar sorts of talks about climate change and the impact on the environment, there was a consideration of that. One of the speakers said something around, well, hedge your bets, plant a variety of things, plant some things which are perhaps more drought tolerant than you might imagine. And in the success case, if climate does change significantly in the short term, then maybe you will have planted the right things. So that's just something to contemplate. Don't assume that we will continue to have the same conditions for gardening as we have now. And then the last point here is your land. We talked a little bit about the catchment of water and the water use. And I use the term here, slow the flow. So Diana has illustrated, I showed at the beginning, what happens if you have 6 centimeters of rain overnight. There's little chance that you will allow the natural systems, you will be able to supplement the natural systems to capture 6 centimeters of water. I think that's probably a non-starter. But what you can do is you can modify your garden land use. You can leverage berms. That if you go into the classic permaculture world, berms and swales, berms are installed parallel to slope. Yeah, that's right, parallel to slope, to reduce the movement of water, to slow the water down. So there's more chance of it infiltrating on a garden scale. That's something you can achieve. And, I've got areas in the garden that I never dreamed would be moist enough for things in the summer, and yet they are, because I've put berms in place, and berms then accumulate and accommodate the water. You get an organic buildup, the soil profile develops, it slows things down, and so you get this success story of improving your garden space on a bigger natural scale. We can do work like is going on at Whockwem, and I'm going to point that way because it's just down the valley from where I live. Whockwem, Burgoyne Bay, they now have 2 significant wetland areas in that watershed area, and that's another way of trying to reinstate the natural systems that are able to accommodate rainwater capture. So wetlands, lowland wetlands, highland wetlands, they store the water, they reduce its ability to flow away to the sea. The chances of us keeping more than 20% may never be there, but at least it's an effort to instill improved groundwater recharge. If you don't have gardens and you're not worried about permaculture and so on and so on, then it's look at the natural land covers and rebuild, try to build or rebuild the natural systems to allow groundwater recharge. The natural systems, you can talk about them as natural ecosystem services. The natural systems are responsible today on this island for our ability to trap the rainwater that lands and slow its runoff to the sea. So we capture a quantity of water as a result of the natural systems, and we also improve the quality of the water that's flowing in the surface and that's going into the ground. The natural ecosystem services are playing a very significant role in helping us. And so, the flip side of that is if you go to a city, or we didn't have those natural ecosystem services because of logging, climate change, well, then maybe we'd be into installing more kit, more infrastructure. The DAF plant that St Mary's Lake has, I don't know how much that has cost, but let's say $30 million. We'd have to do more to produce the water quality that we need. Maybe there's less water available because we haven't got the quantity from the natural system storage or the natural system capture. So there's a few kind of mitigation strategies there. All of them have some merit. All of them are doable on this island right now. Okay, so freshwater on an island, the bottom line, less is more. And less, in this case, is less usage, and more is that the fresh water that we don't use becomes available to our island's community and our environment. And given that our community is completely dependent, largely dependent, I should say, on the natural ecosystem services that I've outlined, this natural systems, forests, wetlands, and so on, capturing water and facilitating its storage in the ground. If we don't have those natural ecosystem services, we don't have community. If we do too much in the community in terms of usage, then we're impacting the natural ecosystem services. Diana didn't mention that, but if you take a declining water table, it doesn't just affect our water supply systems; it affects our forest populations, our precious natural ecosystems, and so those decline. Whether the cedar dieback that we see is entirely attributable to that, I don't think so, but it's something to consider. There is this interconnectedness of things that is so important for us. Okay, and the last point here is really do it now. There's no reason why we can't do things now. There are actually grants available for water system installations. There's a lot of material out there. And here are some of the resources that you can draw on, just a few links to give you a path along the road. So, I don't know whether this will be shared at the end, but we could put that out there. There's guidelines on non-potable rainwater catchment that were locally tailored by SWEPA, Watershed Protection Alliance, on non-potable rainwater, and some steer on the requirements for potable rainwater, which are quite onerous. I have to say the legislation there is not finessed to make it an easy path. There's an agricultural water calculator. So if you're just new to this, new on the island, or you're considering how you might change your lifestyle and water use, then there is this thing called the water irrigation calculator, which is quite elegant. There's a little brochure on Know Your Groundwater Well. Again, maybe you've just assumed that well at the bottom of the garden will always deliver. Well, it's good to know how it works. And if you're new to the island, it's good to know that it is that well that delivers your water, or the lake nearby. It's not town water coming from some other place in the province. There's a lot of information on caring for your land, whether it's on a natural land stewardship perspective, or the usage of land and agriculture from a small scale permaculture perspective. At the bottom here, there's some stuff on raising awareness. I mean, we have this project. I think Shauna alluded to that in the introduction for myself. Our freshwater catalogue is a there's a watershed stewardship project looking at the island's water and trying to get a better handle on where surface water flows, where does it flow year round, perhaps informing the Mike Shee models that may or may not be developed for this island, ground truthing those models to make sure that they are honouring the surface data that's available and the well data that's available actually. And then if you're just interested in how the seasons are changing over the years, I would always recommend going to the UVic weather station systems. There are 5 weather stations on the island at schools, and they will give you some real insights into what did the rain do yesterday. Was that a 3 centimetre event? Was it unusual? It's a pretty rich UVic weather station website if you want to get into that. And that's it really. Catch, store, use, and slow the flow. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks so much, John. That was excellent. Lots of really good actionable tips that you shared with us. There's a few questions that came in while you were speaking, and I'll just ask one to you personally before I invite everyone back in for a bit more of a discussion. Someone asked, what is the best for the environment, plastic or concrete cisterns, in your opinion?
Mm-hmm. Wow, that is a long answer. So in that perfect world of doing comparisons, as the question asked, we would have a full life cycle cost of generating the plastic from hydrocarbons, and I've been in that business, so I know that is not as simple as it looks, or generating concrete from a quarry and mixing it with an organic rich substance and baking all of that together to make cement, and then finding the materials to make concrete. You know, those are 2 very different paths. Both are messy, to say the least. I don't have an answer. I wouldn't like to put my name or my head on the block actually, and give an answer to that one. I think it's perhaps influenced more about, in this situation, it's perhaps influenced more about cost and suitability for your site. So I'd say they're both ugly, to be honest. They're both ugly. Plastic and concrete are both ugly. But, you know, we are mankind and we need water, and we have to find ways of storing it. And you know, I think the Californian route of pumping water back into the ground is an elegant one, but that is not an insignificant cost. And, you know, and with the rocks that Diana has outlined that we have on this island, we wouldn't necessarily know where that water was going, even if we did pump it into the ground. So, you know, it could turn up in the middle of the bay in front of that ferry that's on the slide. I mean, it's a challenging one. So we have to deal with what we have, plastic or concrete, and your conditions and financial situation, on your conditions on the ground and your financial situation, I think would be the thing that would lead you down one or other path.
Mm-hmm. And I don't know if the folks from Galiano Conservancy are still here, but I know that the Galiano Conservancy was able to build their own water cistern using some natural materials. I can't remember exactly what it was. It was some kind of fiber, and they built up a natural cistern, which sounded like it was extremely labor intensive, but they had community support to do so. So who knows, maybe if you can get some neighbors together, you can all help each other build individual cisterns out of some natural materials, if you've got the time and the people support. So with that, I will invite Diana and Bridget back in. I'm going to take this slide off. So we are going to move through more of a discussion. I've got some questions that I've recorded throughout the conversation, and folks can jump in if they have something else to add to the conversation. I'm going to start with this question. This one is for Bridget. I did a close read of Bridget's paper before we came into this conversation, so I think I might be a little bit more familiar with it beyond what just her presentation said. So something that really came up for me in reading that paper was that with California American Water submitting their permit application to build a desal plant, something that they were intending to do to reapply for this permit was to discuss environmental justice and cost concerns with residents. And I know that the environmental, financial, and energy costs of desal have been well documented in literature, but could you maybe touch a little bit on what sorts of environmental justice and social concerns desalination plants might bring to the community?
Okay, yeah. So specifically for like the Monterey case, that entire region's water supply, the desalination plant, has to go somewhere. And the siting that had been proposed was near the town of Marina. And so I had shown on my slides a schematic of this slant well so rather than going, straight down, it was situated, the wellhead was situated on land, and the well was actually at like a 14-degree angle below the horizontal to extend out into the ocean. But because of some protected habitat and like fragile dune ecosystem that was along the coast, the wellhead had to be situated further back from the actual like coastline than would have been ideal. And so the result was that this slant well would be pulling water from along its whole length, but that the majority of the length, instead of being underneath the ocean where it would be capturing the seawater, was instead underneath dry land and within the jurisdiction of this marina community, which is for the area has like a relatively high concentration of like low income and like low income community. And so one of the big environmental justice concerns was whether or not, this well would be taking significant groundwater from Marina's reserves. And another dimension of that is the Cal-Am recognized this possibility in their modeling. And so they had proposed the solution to whatever incidental fresh groundwater they're taking in, they would pay back at a very, very low cost. But for reasons that were never quite clear, that water would have actually been going back to the town of Castroville instead of Marina. And so certainly a distributional issue where, Marina was being asked to, take on this risk and this threat to their groundwater reserves, because if there's incidental take of groundwater, that could exacerbate seawater intrusion. So it's not just the volume of freshwater lost, it's all the associated impacts that could come along with that. And certainly not being on board with that or being compensated for that. So that was a big issue with this specific case. And then more broadly, just the decision-making process, like the transparency and the accountability and how the public's voices are being heard in the decision to go with one project or another.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That's a really great answer. Another question that came up, someone suggested this during John's talk, was the potential of having helicopters deliver water to individual islands. And I think that presents another solution that would displace water stress to another community. And it also brings up the concern of more fuel being burnt. So these social concerns around water use are really important to consider. John, do you have a comment on that?
I do. I've seen helicopters delivering water. And that was in the Middle East, in the mountains, where they get maybe less than 10, 15 centimeters of water a year. That's landing, not going into the ground. So in those situations, I'd say that's appropriate. But here we've got the clouds, which do pretty well on that front. So, I mean, if you install rainwater catchment, just to give you a really nice thing that, blew my mind away a couple of years back, a rainwater harvesting tour on the island. We go to someone's house, they are collecting rainwater. He's got a dustbin next to the gutter on his roof, and he's got a pump in the bottom of the dustbin. And he said, "This is my rainwater catchment system." And we're looking at the dustbin and thinking that won't last very long. But the pump takes it behind his garage, and behind his garage, he's got a second-hand swimming pool that stores 8,000 gallons of water, and it takes 2 weeks to fill. So, and that then is more. In fact, the only downside of this particular setup, he said, was that the swimming pool was too big. He didn't need all that water. So there you go. So alternative to helicopters.
Right. Great suggestion. I will move over to Diana. A question that came through was, how can we decrease runoff on the Gulf Islands? Is that a potential? can we decrease groundwater runoff?
Well, I think John sort of answered that if you, at least at a small scale, in your own backyard, if you're on a slope, then you could put berms in to try and slow that runoff and capture it. At a scale of an island, that would have potentially some pretty significant environmental impacts. So, it's important to think about modification of the land surface and whether it would do more harm than not to do it at all. So I think at a small scale, trying to promote more infiltration in your own garden is probably okay, but at a big scale, any modification of the hydrology of that island could impact the marine habitat. Like if all of that fresh water was captured and didn't run off to the ocean, then none of the marine biodiversity would exist along the ocean, because those species are adapted to living in an area that gets freshwater discharge. So yeah, it's a difficult balance, and ultimately anything that we do, diversion of water, putting pumping wells in, anything is disrupting that natural hydrological system and ultimately taking fresh water away from something that used to get it before, whether it's the stream or the ocean or the trees. Yeah, so we have to be very careful about what's done.
Absolutely. On that note, I don't know if anyone can speak to this, but this came through as a comment, but I think that there's a question here. Someone mentioned that reverse osmosis that takes place during the desal process is not desirable as drinking, doesn't produce desirable drinking water because it has a lack of minerals, and it can also leach from the pipes, which makes the pipes weaker and then increases infrastructure costs. And I just wonder, is that something that has been documented in literature? Is that something that's been found in desal operations? Bridget, do you have any insight into this?
Yeah, I think, and since this is not like really the specific area I work in, I can't speak to like how widespread this is, but I know that it's a practice actually after you have passed the water through the reverse osmosis to add back in some background, usually like a calcium carbonate minerals, so that it has some dissolved solids and it's not going to then corrode pipes or try to corrode you if you drink it also.
Corrode you. It doesn't sound like a desirable process. Okay, I'm trying to even out the playing field and get different folks to speak. So that went through, we talked about that. Okay, so John, you didn't really get a chance to speak much to the Salt Spring Island Freshwater Catalog. I was just wondering if you could maybe talk about the impetus for that project and how that project might, that model might be emulated on different islands.
You're muted, John.
Yeah, somehow you're muted. How did
emulated on different islands? Well, okay, so I wasn't expecting the sales pitch, but and I'm going to try and limit myself with the sales pitch. So okay, so the Water Preservation Society Freshwater Catalogue project has got three aspects to it. One is education and outreach, so if people know a little bit more about their watersheds, the natural systems that influence the ability to capture rainfall, how the creeks behave through the year, and the changes in how the creeks behave through the year, then maybe they will be a bit closer to it and maybe a little bit more, apart from being informed, emotionally attached to their watersheds and so on. So that's an education aspect, which is a bit loosey-goosey. It's kind of, you can't really define it very well. But what you can do is you can use the data that's collected, if it's appropriately collected, you can use that to influence science decisions, inform planning, as I like to use the words. So Diana presented some Mike Shee models, and these are using all the available data. We can make a first stab at what an island looks like in terms of its water budget, how much water goes into the ground, how much leaves the island, what is the remaining water, where is it? And those things often can be fine-tuned if you can use some actual data from field measurements. So in this island, we're blessed with a number of year-round creeks. We can measure flow volumes. We can measure chemistry. Chemistry gives you insights into groundwater versus runoff rainwater. And so that's what the project is about. The science is collecting data that we will hope will go into a future model, whether it's Mike Shee or something else, to improve our understanding of our island. I think it's important that we make decisions based on suitable information. So that's really the backdrop. And this slide just happens to show where we're collecting data. It's not all of it, but it's the kind of the concentration areas. I call them local detail. And that's where people are collecting data on a more regular basis at one or more sites. And we've got something like 5,000 data points across the island. So, and some wells. Now we've got something like 16 wells that we're collecting data from to make the connection between the surface water and the groundwater, which is one of the things that we need to understand better. Okay. For other islands, there's no reason. I think Hornby did come to me, or one of the other islands came along and said, could we do something similar? I mean, there's no reason why it couldn't be done. It depends on resources and the number of creeks. And I'm not a good person to articulate how it might work on particular islands in the area. Maybe that's Diana's realm, but it's possible. It is possible to do stuff on other islands in the Gulf. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Another question that just came in a few minutes ago has a bit of a preamble to it. So I'll read it out and we'll see if any of you folks feel equipped to answer it. It says, it's very concerning that hydrologists' reports for applicants seeking rezoning for high-density developments on the islands do not seem to be taking into account already existing water problems. In a neighborhood, anticipated demand from already zoned for build-out or climate change. Applications for commercial water licenses do not seem to be doing so either. Can anyone comment on that?
I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not in the consulting realm, so
yeah, that's fair.
Yeah, I mean, climate change. It's. I led a lot of the research on internationally on climate change impacts on groundwater, and even after doing that for 15, 20 years now, there's still so much uncertainty with not just the Mike Shee models that we use or any other approach that we use to estimate recharge. There's huge uncertainty in these global climate models. So those graphs that I showed in my presentation are from one model, just one of all the models that PKIC has. And usually we look at a range of models, and they're all a little different from each other. So we could take what's called the ensemble average, take a group of models and say, what's the average projection for this area? Or we could say, what's the range of precipitation into the future? So there's huge uncertainty, and we don't even know really what the emission scenarios are going to be. So never mind trying to reproduce even historical data, we don't really know how things are going to change in the future. So it's a very difficult, when you start to do reports, whether it's research papers or student thesis or anything like that, and you're trying to communicate uncertainty to people, a lot of times people aren't very receptive to this concept of uncertainty. And then, so I'm not surprised. I think that the consulting world is trying not to go too far down that rabbit hole of saying, here's our report, but your recharge in the future could be anything from a 0% change to 100% change, because that doesn't get us anywhere. So that might be a reason why, the embracing uncertainty in reports and, incorporating climate change really isn't happening.
Right. And that's something that I saw reflected. There was Golder and Associates did a report in 2019. I think it was on Salt Spring, and something that they found was that regionally, Salt Spring has a fairly consistent water supply, but on a local basis, based on what the rock is doing, how the water is moving across the landscape, it can be really hard to determine whether that locality is going to be able to support wells that recharge. So it seems like it's very difficult, even on a site-by-site basis, to really understand how the water is moving and how it's going to act in the future. So it seems like, and what Golder, I think what they suggested, I think I wrote down a note somewhere that they thought that they needed to do more detailed assessments before any developments were done on a local scale. But then there's like the economic feasibility of that. Can we do these individual assessments for every development that goes through?
Right. Yeah. And having done sort of detailed assessments on the islands, like going in and measuring every single fracture in outcrops, you can't even use that information because when you try and get the information on how many fractures there are and so forth, you still have to make an approximation after you've done that. So trying to do these local scale site assessments are very difficult given the complexity of the rocks on the islands. And I'm sure John would agree with that statement. There are fractures everywhere.
Yeah.
And all it takes is one fracture to be the main water-bearing fracture for that well. And you have really no idea where it is, from a driller's log when they're drilling down, pay dirt, you get that water supply and you go, yay. But where does that fracture come from? Who knows?
I know this is Rain Coast, and the words oil and gas don't feature very strongly in this conversation, but the history shows oil and gas businesses and exploration and exploitation of resources, freshwater is another resource. People don't explore for fractures. Fractures are the last resort in any resource exploitation system, with maybe one exception. So it's a challenging game to be in. As Diana said, the ability to predict where that fracture is, I'd say it's a bit of a dartboard and a blindfolded dart player. 1 in 6, 1 in 10 wells may encounter a good fracture network, but that isn't about expertise, it's about serendipity.
Mm-hmm. And when it comes to adjoining wells, so a new well gets put in on a property, there's really no way to predict with any certainty what the impact will be on the neighbor's well. Because, going back to that slide I showed where we tend to treat everything like this uniform porous media when in reality it's not. All of the methods that hydrogeologists use to look at what are the potential impacts on neighbor B's well, they all use that first model, that simple one, because we don't know where the fractures are. So, it's just a very, very difficult environment, steep topography, very complicated rocks, never mind the fractures. The rocks are complicated, particularly on Salt Spring Island. And then you've got this overprint of fractures that just make it incredibly difficult, unlike places where you're in a nice alluvial valley with sand and gravel. So California, the parts of California, central US, very easy geology. And so they have an easier time, believe it or not, trying to characterize the subsurface than we have on the islands that we have here. And then the other big issue when you're talking about water balances is we have no idea how much water we use. Really, the average homeowner has no clue. Even city, if you're on a meter in the city and you get charged for it, then yes, you would know how much water you use. But most well owners don't have a water meter, and there's no idea how much water footprint people are having.
What would be the best way to track that water footprint? Is that something that, is that like kind of just on an individual basis, or is there a way to get people to do that?
So there are things going on. The water districts on the island, I didn't mention those, but there are something like 13, 14 water districts on the island, each purveyors of water to the community, some surface water, some subsurface water. They are looking and do to a degree do metering. So metering on an individual household supply, but it's an expensive retrofit if you want to do it after the event, which is where we are with most of the places on the island, putting a meter on someone's pipe. But I think it's going down a road that will become more and more where it is individual households are metered, and then if those individual households want to use water, then they're going to be paying for it.
The problem comes, the problem comes with the individual domestic water well, right? That if you're on a system, a water supply system, then it makes sense that it's a shared resource. And even though groundwater should be a shared resource, and we should all be responsible for taking what we need, but the concept that it's my well, I drilled it, I can take how much water I want, really does not help.
So we're getting low on time. We only have about 4 minutes left, and I wanted to give some airtime to someone who hasn't asked a question yet. So Austin asked, if when there was an increase in salinity and recharge due to climate change, is there a clear tipping point of ecosystem balance with respect to an island ecosystem, or would it be a gradual change?
I'm not quite clear whether the question is related to increase in salinity of the groundwater due to sea level rise. So there wouldn't be a change in salinity of precipitation or recharge. There would be a change in salinity near the coast, or potentially as the water table is falling. As John mentioned, you can have changes in your water chemistry, which could also include a change in salinity. So I'm just not quite clear about that question.
Right. Austin, if you want to follow up with that to add some clarity, maybe we can try to get to it before the end of the discussion. Someone else asked, how does your panel feel about fracking wells in island geography or geology in the hope of improving water yield? John, you look like you have a reaction.
Yeah, there's a particular type of oil and gas resource where fracking is the norm, and it is a solution to fractured reservoirs and exploiting those resources, and it would be the same with water, but the unknowns in there and the cost would be very significant. So there's two elements. There's the unknowns in terms of where would it go. You know, Diana's indicated the fractures could be somewhere in a well. What happens if you pump at a high rate with the equipment to do that? Where did that go? And, you know, would it impact your neighbor's well, or, you know, what would it do? I think the unknowns are very significant. The cost would be a very, very big issue. There are other avenues to explore, which perhaps we don't want to go into here, but drilling a non-vertical well, for instance. But you know, that's not the sort of game you would play. The average consumer would want to spend on drilling a well in an island domain. I think it would be pretty much a non-starter.
Right. So we have time for one more question. I'm going to direct it to Bridget. Someone had, again, more of a comment than a question. But they said, hopefully these webinars will be a catalyst for our islands to proactively plan around water rather than waiting for a greater water crisis. They went on to say that the Monterey example is sobering. And I wonder, as someone who studied the Monterey example, what would you say is a good starting point for folks who are in a less dire situation than Monterey, perhaps, but what do you think are the essential steps to getting sustainable about the way that we're handling our water?
Yeah, so I would echo, I think actually both John and Diana brought this up in different respects, but this idea of awareness of the state of your resources and what's happening with the hydrology. I think in Monterey and a lot of other places in California, there's this kind of like selective blindness to the long-term patterns of water use, where today there's water coming out of the wells, and so kind of just not think about the fact that those levels have dropped 10 feet in the past 5 years, and today there's water coming out of the wells. And so being aware of the state of what is the water balance of your basins or of your rivers, or what's happening with like fish populations given the amount of extractions that's happening in the rivers, and who has wells that are vulnerable if groundwater levels continue to fall. I think kind of getting this sort of state of the system is very powerful to propel like awareness for what kind of change needs to happen in an area.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's amazing. That was a perfectly timed answer. We're at 1:30 exactly. So I'd like to thank all three of you for being here. This was an incredibly illuminating conversation, very informative. Everyone here, this presentation will be available online if you want to watch it again or share it with folks that you know. So we'll end it there. Thank you everyone for being here.
Okay.
Bye.
Okay.